The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless drone as Rachel Torres moved through the corridors of St. Michael's Hospital in Norfolk, her movements economical and precise, the way someone walks when they've learned that stillness draws attention. 6 weeks into her temp assignment and she'd perfected the art of being invisible, a skill honed across 3 continents and 2 decades of keeping secrets that could reshape nations. Her scrubs were standard issue, wrinkled at the cuffs, and her name badge read simply Torres, RN, temp staff, which was technically true and monumentally incomplete. The stethoscope around her neck was a tool. The badge was a disguise. The woman wearing them was something else entirely. Her hands, those were the problem. Hands that had held suction tubes during hemorrhage control. Hands that had applied tourniquets in sandstorms. Hands that had performed emergency tracheotomies in FOB Shanks trauma tent with nothing but a 14-gauge angiocath needle and absolute certainty that hesitation meant death. Those hands now hung at her sides, deliberately unclenched, as she approached room 347 where the young officer lay recovering. The bandages wrapped around his head were fresh. The monitors beside his bed beeped in their algorithmic rhythm. The 4 bags hung like translucent witnesses to his slow reconstruction. Room 347 had become her center of gravity at St. Michael's, though she couldn't explain why to anyone who asked, which nobody did. Nobody asked Rachel Torres anything. Nobody looked at her long enough to wonder. That was the whole point of disappearing. She checked the clock on the wall, 11:11 a.m., and pulled the privacy curtain closed with one smooth motion that made barely a sound. The young officer's eyes were closed. She scanned his chart, Lieutenant James Kavanaugh, 23, multiple trauma from IED detonation, Sanjin Valley, 3 weeks post-op, cognitive recovery in progress. Her eyes lingered on the cognitive recovery note. The doctors wanted him to heal his body. Rachel wanted him to heal his mind. Those weren't always the same thing. She was adjusting his full line when something caught the light. His left forearm. The tattoo was small but deliberate, dark ink against younger skin than the rest of him, RACHEL, spelled out in block letters along his inner wrist. Her breath caught, a physical reaction she hadn't allowed herself in 7 years, and she forced her inhale to slow, to deepen, to become mechanical. Just a nurse checking a patient. Nothing more. The officer's eyes remained closed. The machines continued their beeping. The universe stayed exactly where it should be, balanced on a knife's edge. The tattoo was from the extraction mission. Sanjin Valley, November, the wind so hot it burned your lungs. 12 men in her unit, pinned by coordinated fire from 3 ridgelines, ammunition running low, air support 17 minutes out. She'd carried this man 5 miles through enemy terrain with his arm bleeding arterial spurts and his voice calling out her name like it was the only thing keeping him conscious. RACHEL. So he'd remember her. So he'd never forget that he'd survived because she'd refused to leave him. Except he had forgotten. The IED that shattered his skull 17 days ago had rewritten his memory like a corrupted hard drive, and now she was just another nurse in green scrubs adjusting his fluids while he slept. She finished checking his vitals, blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 68, O2 sat 97%, and made the notation on his chart in her careful, anonymous handwriting. Professional. Invisible. She was turning to leave when he stirred, his eyes fluttering open but not quite focusing, and for a moment she stood frozen beside his bed, knowing that if he opened his eyes fully and saw her, something would happen that she couldn't control. But he didn't. His eyes drifted closed again, and she slipped out of the room like she'd never been there at all. The medication cart was waiting in the hallway, and Rachel was checking Dr. Mercer's orders against the actual prescriptions when she saw it. A 10 mg dosage of metoprolol marked for a patient in room 339 who weighed 71 pounds. A pediatric patient. A 10-year-old with a heart murmur, not a cardiac emergency. The dose was quadruple what the protocol allowed. 1 administration would push the child into bradycardia. 2 could cause syncope. 3 could cause permanent damage. She could feel the weight of it before she even pulled the chart, the wrongness, the carelessness, the absolute certainty that this error had been made by someone who'd stopped paying attention 40 years ago. An intern named Morrison was standing nearby, reviewing his own stack of charts, and Rachel made a decision that would become the first domino in a catastrophe she couldn't yet see. She walked over to him and kept her voice level, kept her eyes on the paperwork, kept her entire body language suggesting this was just routine clarification. Metoprolol for room 339, she said quietly. 10 milligrams is above protocol for a 71-pound patient. The standard dose is 0.15 per kilogram. That puts us at just over 5 milligrams maximum. She turned the chart so he could see the dosing calculation already written there in her handwriting, clear and undeniable. Morrison's face flushed. He was 26, still innocent enough to feel shame. "I'll alert Dr. Mercer immediately," he said, already moving, already looking for the attending. That was when Rachel saw him. Dr. Thomas Mercer stood at the far end of the hallway near the nurse's station, watching her with an expression that looked like a predator identifying the moment a prey animal made itself vulnerable. He was 62, had been at St. Michael's for 34 years, and had never once been corrected by a temp nurse in front of anyone who mattered. His face reddened slowly, a flush that started at his collar and crept upward like ink in water. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched her as Morrison hurried toward him, the corrected chart in hand, the entire trajectory of Rachel's invisibility collapsing in real time. 3 seconds. That was all it took. Dr. Mercer's eyes were the color of old ice, and in them Rachel saw something she recognized from her years in the Hindu Kush, not anger, but wounded pride. The kind that learned to weaponize itself. The kind that plotted. She'd seen that expression on the faces of men who'd been humiliated in front of their subordinates, and she knew with absolute certainty that her 7-week run of perfect invisibility at St. Michael's was over. She'd made a choice, let the child suffer, or draw attention to herself. She'd chosen the child. She'd known what the cost would be. And she'd chosen it anyway. That was the last choice she would make at St. Michael's that felt like a choice. The break room on the 4th floor smelled like burnt coffee and the specific staleness of a space where people didn't want to be. Rachel sat at the corner table with a cup of water, not even pretending to eat, not even pretending to belong, and watched the ritual play out like a choreography everyone had already learned. Sandra from cardiology arrived first, saw Rachel, and immediately gathered her lunch container. Took her time standing up, made sure Rachel saw her leaving. Made sure the message was clear, "You're not welcome here." Then Michelle from pediatrics, who'd been friendly during week 2, who'd shown Rachel pictures of her grandchildren on her phone. Michelle didn't meet her eyes. Just gathered her things and followed Sandra out. Then 2 of the day shift residents, then a nursing assistant Rachel had helped during a patient code 3 weeks ago. Within 90 seconds, the break room had transformed from a gathering space into a shrine to ostracism. Rachel sat alone at the table, her water cup in front of her, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white. She could hear the microwave humming from the hallway. Could hear the distant beeping of monitors. Could hear the movement of hospital machinery that never stopped, never slept, never cared about the politics of the people who kept it running. She didn't feel humiliation. She'd trained that out of herself years ago, back in the Hindu Kush when you learned that emotional reactions got people killed. What she felt was something colder, confirmation. The calculation was precise. She'd corrected Dr. Mercer in front of an intern, which meant she'd embarrassed him, which meant he would need to reassert dominance, which meant the entire floor would become hostile terrain. He had the power in this equation. He had seniority, credentials, institutional authority. She had 7 weeks and a temporary contract. The mathematics of the situation resolved themselves instantly. The door opened and another nurse, Jennifer, from the morning shift, appeared with her lunch. She looked at Rachel sitting alone, looked at the empty chairs, and for a moment Jennifer's face showed the calculation to join Rachel and be seen as aligned with her, or pretend not to see her and preserve her own standing. Jennifer chose to preserve herself. She turned and left without a word. Rachel took a sip of her water. It was lukewarm and tasted like the plastic cup. She had 47 minutes left on her lunch break, and there was nowhere else to go. The locker room would feel like a violation. The nurse's station was now hostile territory. The supply closet was for hiding, and she didn't hide. So she sat in the break room alone and waited for time to pass, her right hand unconsciously reaching for the inside of her jacket where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining. A flag. An insignia. A reminder of who she actually was when nobody was watching. The whispers started in the medication room during the afternoon shift change. Rachel was restocking the crash cart when she heard Mercer's voice through the partially opened door, smooth and confiding, pitched for ears only. "You know, I looked into Torres's background. 3 previous positions, all terminated. Theft allegations at 2 of them. Nobody wants to say it outright, but the pattern is there." She didn't move. Didn't acknowledge. Her hands continued organizing supplies, gauze, saline flushes, epinephrine vials, each item placed with surgical precision while her mind catalogued every word like intel for a debrief that would never come. "I'm just concerned," Mercer continued, his tone dripping with manufactured worry, "about what we're exposing ourselves to. A nurse with her background working in our unit? It's a liability. A real liability." The other nurse, it sounded like Jennifer from Days, made a soft noise of agreement. Rachel heard the scrape of medication bottles, the sound of compliance, of allegiance shifting like sand under pressure. By the next morning, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the nurse's station. Everyone saw it. Everyone read it. Employee Incident Report, confidential. Employee, Rachel Torres. Date, current date. Incident, insubordination and unsafe practices. Narrative, as multiple staff members have raised concerns regarding Torres's adherence to hospital protocol and scope of practice. Patient safety must remain our primary concern. Recommendation, immediate remedial training required. Continued monitoring mandatory. Signed, Dr. Marcus Mercer, MD. Chief Resident, Emergency Medicine. Rachel stood in front of the board while other nurses pretended not to watch her read her own professional execution. The fluorescent light above buzzed like an insect trapped in a cage. She could feel the weight of their stares, quick, furtive glances that scattered the moment she looked up. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody spoke. She memorized the exact wording. The clinical language that made accusations without evidence. The institutional authority behind his signature. This wasn't a private conversation anymore. This was documented. Permanent. The kind of paper trail that followed nurses from hospital to hospital, whispered about in reference checks, the reason hiring committees took 5 minutes to say no. 3 hours later, she changed Mrs. Patterson's for in room 289. Routine work. Competent work. The kind of care she delivered thousands of times, antiseptic swab, palpate the vein, smooth insertion, secure the line. Clean. Efficient. Professional. But Mrs. Patterson's entire family crowded into the room today. A son home from work. 2 daughters visiting from out of state. A grandson filming everything on his phone. They filled the space like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. Mercer appeared in the doorway at 2:06 p.m., his timing surgical. He stepped into the room with the confidence of a man about to perform something he'd rehearsed, his voice carrying the false gentleness of a prosecutor asking a leading question. "Nurse Torres, would you care to explain your supposed qualifications to Mrs. Patterson's family?" He smiled at the family as if he and they were sharing a private joke. "Because I've reviewed your file and I'm not seeing anything that justifies the confidence you seem to have in your abilities." Rachel's hand stilled on the 4 line. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. In fact, Mercer continued, his voice sliding into something more aggressive, "I'm questioning whether you should be practicing at all. Your background doesn't exactly inspire confidence in patient safety." Mrs. Patterson's son leaned forward. Both daughters exchanged glances. The grandson lowered his phone slightly, uncertain whether this was part of the show or something else entirely. Rachel turned to face him. Her jaw tightened. The muscle beneath her left eye twitched once, the only visible crack in her composure, but when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It came from somewhere deeper than breathing, from that part of her that had negotiated life and death in the Hindu Kush with nothing but hand signals and the understanding that hesitation killed people. "Your insecurity is showing, Doctor." She held his gaze with the flat, unblinking stare of someone who had learned to read a room's entire tactical situation in 2 seconds. "It's the only thing about you that's consistent." The silence that followed was the kind you could cut with a 14-gauge needle. Mercer's face flushed purple from his neck to his hairline. 2 residents standing in the hallway behind him froze mid-conversation. Mrs. Patterson's family stared at Rachel with the particular expression of people who had just watched someone walk off a cliff without checking for a net. Rachel turned and walked out of the room without waiting for his response. Didn't explain herself. Didn't apologize. Didn't look back. She simply left, her movements fluid and economical, each step a statement. Mercer stood alone in the middle of the room, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, all his rehearsed sophistication evaporating under the weight of what had just happened in front of witnesses. One of the residents actually looked away, unable to watch the implosion. The break room the next day was an exercise in social ostracism that would have made a prison yard boss take notes. Rachel arrived during the afternoon shift to find 6 nurses clustered around the small table, gathered tightly, speaking in low voices that stopped the moment the door opened. When they saw her, they moved in perfect unison. Lunches gathered. Coffee cups retrieved. Silent exodus. Within 30 seconds, she sat alone at the table with her sandwich and a bottle of water, watching the space they'd occupied cool. She ate without tasting anything. Pain was information. Isolation was intelligence. She'd survived worse than silence. The medication room. The supply closet. The hallway outside radiology. Everywhere, she caught the tail end of conversations that scattered like birds before a predator. Mercer says she was fired from her last 3 positions. For theft, I heard. St. Michael's isn't usually this careless with hiring. Rachel moved through the hospital like a ghost moving through walls, present but not acknowledged, acknowledged but not welcome. She went to work. She did her job. She kept her hand steady and her voice level and her eyes on the patient in front of her, nothing else. The young Navy officer in room 347 still looked right through her when she checked his 4. His head injury from the IED blast had taken 3 years from his memory, or maybe it was 5, the paperwork was sparse on those kinds of details. His eyes tracked to her hands, to the monitor, to the drip rate, but didn't land on her face. There was no recognition there. No memory of a woman who'd carried him 5 miles through Taliban fire, her own left shoulder screaming with shrapnel, her breath coming in shallow bursts because a round had torn through her ribs but not deep enough to kill her, just deep enough to hurt with every single step. She didn't tell him. Didn't say a word. Just adjusted his lines and left. Late that same day, Mercer cornered her outside the nurse's station. The timing was careful. Strategic. Just before the shift change when the hallway would be busy enough to provide an audience but not so busy that anyone would intervene. Torres, I need to have a conversation with you about scope of practice. His voice was loud enough for 2 residents to hear, loud enough for the unit clerk to lift her head from the computer, loud enough to set the stage. You've been overstepping. Making decisions that should belong to physicians. Suggesting treatment protocols. Acting like you understand medicine when you clearly don't. He stepped closer, his presence meant to be intimidating, his institutional authority backing every word like a weapon. Rachel stood still. Her jaw tightened. Her hands hung at her sides, perfectly relaxed, perfectly ready. The trembling that might have come, the flinch, the step backward, the defensive words, never arrived. She simply waited. Silent. Present. Fixed him with that same cold, flat stare that had already cost him dignity in front of a patient's family. He kept talking. He had to keep talking because her silence was worse than any word she could have thrown at him. Her silence said, I hear you. I understand completely. And I don't care what you think. When he finally left, the two residents went back to their work without comment. The unit clerk clicked back to her keyboard. The hallway returned to its normal rhythm like nothing had happened. But something had shifted. Rachel could feel it in the air, like the pressure drop before a storm, the dangerous sense that the situation had escalated past social warfare into something that required different weapons. Mercer had shown his hand. He'd proven he was willing to use his position publicly, repeatedly, systematically. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what he'd do next. The fluorescent lights above room 347 cast everything in a sterile white that made blood look almost unreal. Rachel was adjusting the four-drip when she heard the doors burst open downstairs, not the controlled urgency of a code blue, but something rawer. Shouting. The kind of voice that belonged to someone with nothing to lose and everything to take. She didn't move. Not yet. The commotion was 3 floors down, contained, manageable. The Navy officer in the bed, his name was Mitchell, though he didn't remember her anymore, stared at the ceiling tile with the vacant expression of someone whose brain had been scrambled by an IED blast in Sanjin Valley 14 months ago. His forearm still bore the tattoo of her name, rendered in black ink that had faded the same way memory fades, present but untethered from meaning. The elevator shaft hummed. Once. Twice. Then silence that felt like held breath. Rachel's hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who had stitched wounds under mortar fire, who had threaded central lines by headlamp in a FOB infirmary where the only anesthetic was morphine and the certainty that everyone around you was dying. The foot catheter slipped into place. Saline began its slow drip into Mitchell's vein. She was already turning to check his monitor when the stairwell door exploded open at the far end of the corridor, not violently, just sudden, the kind of entrance that carries its own gravity. A man in dark clothes, face contorted, weapon raised. Not aimed yet. Not quite. But the way he held it told Rachel everything. This was someone who had learned to use it, someone whose hands knew the weight and recoil the way other people's hands knew how to hold coffee cups or children's hands. Everything slowed. The gunman swept the corridor, left, right, back to left again, his eyes hunting for pharmacy signage or supply closets or anyone who looked like they might have access to narcotics. His voice cracked like a whip. Where are the drugs? Fentanyl, morphine, oxycodone, I want them now or I start shooting. A nurse at the far station froze. Then moved. Not toward the gunman, away from him, her hand fumbling for the panic button that would bring security in maybe 2 minutes, which was 120 seconds too late for anyone in this hallway. The gunman's attention swiveled toward the movement like a turret acquiring a target. And that's when Rachel saw the moment his eyes landed on Mitchell's bed, on the naval officer lying motionless with the kind of vulnerability that only comes from brain injury, from being unable to defend himself, from being exactly the sort of person a man with nothing to lose targets first. The weapon rose. Rachel didn't think. Muscle memory took over, the kind that lives in bone and scar tissue, the kind that doesn't wait for permission from the prefrontal cortex. Her body simply moved, stepping between the barrel and Mitchell's bed with the kind of calm that belongs to people who have already made peace with dying. She didn't raise her hands. Didn't shout. Didn't plead. She simply stood there, one hand still on the fall line, the other at her side, her eyes level with the gunman's, and she waited for him to make his choice. He made it. 3 shots. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a hammer striking metal, again and again. The first round punched into her right shoulder, tearing through the trapezius muscle and exiting high on her scapula, a pain like lightning forks through her body. The second hit her ribcage, lower left, shattering 2 ribs and punching through the top of her right lung, filling the space with blood that had nowhere to drain. The third struck her thigh, femoral area, close enough to the artery that she felt the warm rush of blood pooling in her pants leg, gravity and physics working in concert to drain her. She collapsed. The linoleum floor was cold and smelled like bleach and copper, the scent of every hospital in every country where people bled out waiting for help that came too slow. Her vision was already tunneling, the edges of the world contracting to a single pinpoint. She could hear Mitchell screaming, actually screaming, something breaking through whatever cognitive fog the blast had left him in. Footsteps. Shouts. The gunman was moving, abandoning this room for prey less defended, less sacrificial, and Rachel was alone on the floor with the feeling that her chest was filling with something it shouldn't be filling with. Pain was data. Pain was information. Pain told her what her body already knew: tension pneumothorax. The second bullet had collapsed her right lung, and now the pleural cavity was filling with air that had nowhere to escape, crushing her heart with every breath, suffocating her from the inside. She had maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. She could see the crash cart from where she lay, 3 feet away. The 14-gauge angiocath needle was right there. She could see its plastic hub even as her vision darkened at the edges. Her right hand moved toward her chest. Pain screamed through her. She ignored it. The gloves were already on her hands, muscle memory guiding her fingers to the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, just below the collarbone, into the space where needle decompression would buy her time. The anatomy was the same in every body: a thin layer of skin, fascia, intercostal muscle, and then the pleural cavity beyond. Her hands didn't shake. Never had. Not in the Hindu Kush, not in a burning FOB infirmary in Loga province, not now. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was audible, a rush of pressure releasing, like opening a valve on a high-pressure system. Her lung expanded. Her heart wasn't being crushed quite so violently anymore. The oxygen saturation monitor showed numbers climbing: 68, 73, 79. Each percentage point represented another few seconds of consciousness, another chance at not dying on a hospital floor. Boots on tile. Running. The crash team was coming, called by the gunman's shots or Mitchell's screaming or both. But Rachel was already fading, the adrenaline that had kept her functional burning out like a match in wind. She looked up at Mitchell, at the Navy officer staring down at her from the bed, and she saw something shift in his eyes, a crystallization of memory, a moment where neurons fired in sequence and suddenly connected to something real. His lips moved. Her name came out like a question: Rachel. Then the ceiling tiles became familiar, and the white light became something she could rest in, and she let the darkness have her. 3 days. That's how long the fluorescent ceiling tiles had been Rachel's entire world. The hospital ceiling, the same one she'd looked at thousands of times from the other side of the four-stand, now pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. Her left shoulder was immobilized in a figure-8 brace that ran across her chest, the stitches pulling tight every time she breathed too deep. The entry wound on her ribs was wrapped in gauze thick enough to muffle pain into something distant and chemical, courtesy of the morphine drip the nurses kept refreshing without making eye contact. They knew what she was. Or rather, they knew what Dr. Mercer had told them she wasn't. The recovery room was quiet except for the ventilator 2 beds down, its mechanical wheeze creating a rhythm she could sync her breathing to if she tried. She didn't try. Trying meant acknowledging that her body had failed her. That 3 bullets had torn through muscle and bone and stopped her dead on a linoleum floor. That a man with Rachel tattooed on his forearm had watched her collapse with recognition finally blooming in his eyes, recognition of someone he'd forgotten, someone his own body remembered before his mind caught up. But he wasn't here. That was the thing that cut deepest, sharper than the chest tubes they'd pulled out yesterday. No flowers on the bedside table. No cards. No visits. Just the steady hiss of oxygen and the beeping of monitors that seemed to measure the seconds of her irrelevance. The door opened around noon. Rachel didn't lift her head. She'd learned not to expect visitors. The orderly who came to check her for was new, young enough that he might not know yet that she was the problem. That she'd contaminated the break room with her presence, that she was the reason the day shift had developed a collective allergy to the trauma bay. "Captain," the orderly said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Rachel's eyes snap open. He wasn't in scrubs. He was in navy dress whites, his uniform sharp enough to cut. He held an envelope in his hands, official-looking, the kind with a red security stripe across the seal. "Someone asked me to deliver this." Rachel's jaw tightened. Her hand moved toward the envelope, then stopped. She couldn't trust anything that came wrapped in that kind of secrecy, not anymore. The orderly, his name tag read Petty Officer 3rd Class Hayes, set the envelope on the bedside table and left without another word. Rachel didn't open it. She lay in the recovery room bed and stared at the envelope the way a person might stare at an unexploded device, waiting for someone else to make the first move. Eventually, the medications pulled her under again, and she let them. Meanwhile, in his office on the 3rd floor, Dr. Mercer was making calls. 3 of them. The first was to hospital board member Patricia Ashford, a woman he'd introduced to her plastic surgeon 5 years ago. The second was to Vice President of Human Resources Marcus Chen, who owed Mercer a favor dating back to a DUI dismissal that had required a sympathetic physician statement. The third was to Dr. Walter Hayes, the hospital's external investigator, who specialized in employee verification and background integrity. "I'm concerned about a liability issue," Mercer said to each of them, his voice carrying the reasonable concern of a man protecting his institution. "We have a temp nurse on staff, Rachel Torres, who may have misrepresented her qualifications. Her previous employment history is inconsistent. I've documented irregularities in her personnel file. Before this escalates into something the board needs to address, I think we should act quickly." What he didn't say, "She embarrassed me in front of my residents." What he didn't say, "I watched her take 3 bullets and I can't get the image out of my head, which means she has something I don't have, and I need her gone before anyone else figures it out." He contacted the temp agency, Martinez Staffing Solutions. He spoke to their supervisor and detailed a series of complaints: unsafe practice, insubordination, potential credential falsification. He didn't mention that Rachel had corrected his dosage calculation. He mentioned instead a pattern of behavior that suggested a dangerous employee operating outside her scope. "We need to review her background," he told the investigator, Dr. Hayes. "I suspect the references she provided may not be verifiable. It would be irresponsible not to follow up." Dr. Hayes was thorough. He was, in fact, very good at his job. He pulled Rachel's file and started making calls to the phone number she'd listed as employment references. The first number rang to a disconnected line. The second rang to a hospital in San Diego that had no record of a Rachel Torres. The third number connected to someone at the Department of Defense, a line that immediately disconnected and transferred him to a voice that said, "This inquiry cannot be processed. Please try again later," and then all the lines went dead. Dr. Hayes made a note in his report: "Employee references cannot be verified. Recommendations pending legal review." That was enough. That was all Mercer needed. The termination call came on day 5, while Rachel was still learning to move without her shoulder screaming in protest. The hospital administrator's name was Patricia Learman, and her voice through the phone carried the practice neutrality of someone delivering bad news to people she'd already decided were problems. "Ms. Torres, we've completed our review of your employment," Learman said. "The hospital has determined that your services as a temporary placement are no longer required, effective immediately. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file. Please return your hospital badge and all access credentials within 48 hours. If you have questions about this decision, you can contact Human Resources." Rachel's hand tightened on the phone, the only reaction she allowed herself. "I need clarification on the reason for termination." "Liability concerns," Learman said. "Dr. Mercer has documented inconsistencies in your background verification that the hospital cannot overlook. We have to prioritize staff safety and institutional credibility." She didn't say, "You took 3 bullets for a patient." She didn't say, "You saved his life." She didn't say, "Thank you, we're sorry, you're a hero." She said, "Your badge." 48 hours. The line went dead. Rachel was home by evening. Her daughter, Emma, was with a neighbor, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, who had no idea why Rachel's shift had ended early, why the temp nurse had suddenly become an unemployed nurse sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. Rachel had told Emma, "Mommy's just tired, honey. Mrs. Chen will give you dinner. I'll pick you up in an hour." And then she'd come home and sat down at the kitchen table and let the silence have her. The stitches in her ribs pulled tight. The phantom pain in her shoulder shot down her arm like electricity. Her chest felt like it was caving in from the inside, and she couldn't tell if it was the injury or the weight of being erased. Twice. First by her country, ordered to disappear, classified out of existence, her service reduced to a redacted file in a locked cabinet. And now by the hospital, by the institution she'd trusted to be better than that, to see the work instead of the person doing it. The tears came without warning, silent and exhausting, the kind that come from a place so deep you didn't know it was hollow until it started filling with salt water. She pressed her good arm against her ribs, careful not to disturb the stitches, and let her forehead rest on the kitchen table. The wood was cool against her skin. The kitchen was so dark she couldn't see her own hands. That's where Emma found her. She'd gotten home early. Mrs. Chen had called the hospital looking for Rachel, trying to understand the termination, and when she couldn't reach anyone, she'd driven Emma to the house herself, worried something was wrong. Emma had her house key. She knew to unlock the door and call out. She knew to turn on lights. Mommy. Her voice was small, confused, the voice of a 6-year-old who couldn't understand why her mother was sitting in the dark crying. Why are you home early? Are you okay? Rachel lifted her head. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture so human and fragile it broke something in her. She looked at her daughter's face, at the confusion there, the worry, the questions a 6-year-old shouldn't have to ask. Everything's fine, baby, Rachel said, and the lie tasted like copper and shame. Mommy just needs to rest. Emma climbed into her lap carefully, aware somehow that her mother was hurt, moving with the gentleness that children show broken things. She wrapped her arms around Rachel's neck, and Rachel held her daughter tight, her good arm locked around that small, perfect body, the one thing in her life that was still real. The one thing no one could take from her. But even that thought felt fragile. Everything was fragile now. Everything was borrowed time. In a medical records office in Washington, D.C., a classified file was being removed from storage. In the Pentagon, a phone was ringing with a priority code attached. In a military barracks in Norfolk, sailors were checking their dress whites and polishing their shoes. In a hospital parking lot, arrangements were being made. Nobody told Rachel any of this. Nobody told her that the Navy officer from room 347, a lieutenant named Nathan Cross, had finally remembered everything, and that remembering her meant setting in motion a machinery so large and so precise that it could move mountains, or at least move one vengeful doctor out of the life of a woman who'd already sacrificed enough. But for now, in the kitchen darkness, Rachel held her daughter and cried silently, the kind of crying that comes when you've given everything and have nothing left, when the world has decided you don't deserve to exist, even after you've proved you were willing to die for someone else. The next morning would change everything. But that night, it was just Rachel and Emma and the weight of all the lies she'd been forced to tell to survive. 7 days. That's how long it took for the truth to arrive at Rachel Torres's apartment. She pulled into the parking lot of her building just after 5 in the evening, the autumn light turning everything the color of rust and old gold. The groceries in her passenger seat were meager: eggs, milk, bread, the staples of a life on pause. Her shoulder ached. Her ribs ached. Her thigh, where the third bullet had torn through muscle, sent electric jolts down her leg with every step. But the pain wasn't what stopped her breathing. 50 Navy sailors stood in her parking lot in dress whites, spaced 3 feet apart, forming a corridor from the street to her apartment door. They weren't moving. They weren't talking. They stood at attention like a spine made of bone and discipline, rigid and absolute, their uniforms the color of winter snow against the darkening asphalt. Rachel's hands went numb on the steering wheel. The lead sailor stepped forward, the man from room 347, whose name she'd never officially learned, whose forearm bore her name in fading ink. He wore the single chevron of a petty officer second class now, or perhaps he always had and she'd been too medicated to notice. In his hands was a folder the color of blood. A citation. His dress whites had the pressed severity of something ceremonial, the kind of uniform worn for things that mattered. "Captain Torres," he began, his voice carrying across the parking lot like a command to every piece of her body to remember how to stand. "For extraordinary valor in the Hindu Kush where you neutralized 12 hostiles while extracting my unit under fire. The screech came first. The sound of a car hitting asphalt at too high a speed, rubber protesting, the physics of momentum and desperation. Dr. Mercer's Audi slammed into the lot's entrance and he barreled out like a man made of rage, his suit coat flapping, his face the color of a cardiac event waiting to happen. He shoved through the formation of sailors. They didn't break. They didn't flinch. They simply parted like water and closed again, unmoved by a man who'd never learned that some people don't break when pushed. "This is insane!" Mercer screamed, his voice cracking with the desperation of someone watching his world collapse in real time. "She's a temp nurse. I have documentation proving she falsified her credentials. This is fraud. This is..." A black SUV pulled into the lot with the casual precision of something that belonged there. A three-star admiral emerged like the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence, dress whites immaculate, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of classified operations and decisions made in rooms where the doors had no handles. His salute to Rachel was crisp, fist to heart, the movement of a man for whom respect wasn't a gesture but a language. Captain Torres served under Operation Clearwater, classification level 6, code name Nightingale, the admiral said, his voice smooth as polished steel. The sailor's eyes went forward, unchanging. Mercer's mouth opened like a door that had lost its hinges. Her medical record has been restored. Her clearance reinstated. And her character is not a matter for civilian review. The admiral's eyes moved to Mercer, and in that glance was every ounce of institutional authority that made nations move. The man wilted. Actually wilted, his shoulders curving inward like a plant cut off from light. Two FBI agents emerged from an unmarked sedan, their suits the color of storm clouds. One of them was speaking into a radio, the other was already moving toward Mercer with handcuffs that caught the dying light like teeth. "Dr. Robert Mercer," the first agent said, "not a question. You're under federal arrest for obstruction of justice, fraudulent documentation, and conspiracy to impede a protected witness. You have the right to remain silent." Mercer tried to run. Actually tried to run, a man in a $1,000 suit attempting to sprint across a parking lot toward nothing, as if velocity could save him. The sailors didn't move. The admiral didn't move. Rachel didn't move. The FBI agents were faster, and they brought him down with the smooth coordination of people who'd done this before, his face meeting asphalt with a sound like a watermelon dropped from a roof. The investigation had been surgical. The FBI had uncovered everything, his calls to board members Patricia Hendricks and the two others, his explicit instructions to the outside investigator Carmichael to find dirt or fabricate concerns, the forged documentation he'd submitted to the temp agency, the falsified complaint stamped with hospital letterhead and his own signature. The temp agency's records showed the pattern, 3 calls from Mercer in the span of 48 hours, each one more frantic than the last, each one pushing harder for immediate termination. Carmichael had cracked within 6 hours of the first FBI interview, providing emails and recorded phone calls where Mercer had offered him $5,000 to dig deeper on Rachel's background. The medical board had voted unanimously to revoke his license pending criminal trial. His malpractice insurance had dropped him within hours of the federal charges being filed. His wife had filed for separation 48 hours after the arrest, taking their daughter and a house in Raleigh where Mercer would never again set foot. But that wasn't the worst of it. The plea deal that his attorney negotiated reduced the federal charges in exchange for testimony against his network at St. Michael's. But the medical board wasn't bound by plea deals. They were bound by the evidence of what he'd tried to do to a decorated officer who'd bled for her country. 6 months later, Rachel would receive an unmarked envelope with a single photograph inside. Dr. Mercer in a community college gymnasium, wearing a cheap polo with a CPR training company logo across the chest, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy to a classroom of bored students who checked their phones. His hairline had receded further. His suit was gone. His hands were demonstrating proper hand placement on a mannequin sternum for $14 an hour. The watermark showed the hourly rate. $14 per hour. But that was later. That was the mathematics of consequences. Right now, in her parking lot, Rachel watched him being read his rights as his face bled onto asphalt that didn't care about titles or credentials or the desperate men who built their entire existence on humiliating others. She stood in her navy dress uniform, the one she hadn't worn in 8 years, the one that still fit her like memory made manifest. Her daughter, Emma, gripped her hand with the intensity of a child who finally understood that her mother wasn't just a temp nurse who worked long shifts and came home with dark circles under her eyes. The ribbon rack on Rachel's chest caught the last light: Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart again, Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, the color of service made visible. The faded unit patch from Operation Clearwater was restored to her shoulder, visible and legitimate and true. The 50 sailors held their salute for a 10 count, their arms raised in unison like a single body rendered in white cotton and ceremony. Then they lowered their arms with the precision of people trained to move as one entity, and they began to file past, each one stopping to shake her hand. Petty Officer Second Class Cross came last, and in his other hand was something small and folded. He pressed it into her palm with the reverence of someone returning something sacred. "This belongs where people can see it," he said quietly, and Rachel unfolded the original mission patch from Operation Clearwater, the one she'd sewn into her jacket lining 3 decades ago when she was young enough to believe she could carry her identity in hiding forever. The Admiral approached last, and he was holding a set of orders stamped with the seal of Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. "You're recalled to active duty," he said, handing them to her. "Medical instructor. Training the next generation of combat medics. Your classification has been downgraded. You exist again, Captain." Rachel looked at the orders. Her name. Her rank. Her history, finally visible. St. Michael's Hospital had issued a formal written apology and offered her a position as a nurse educator. She declined it in writing, with a single line: "I will be teaching elsewhere now." The Navy would give her back something more valuable than a job. It would give her back herself. Emma squeezed her hand, and Rachel squeezed back, and somewhere in the distance, a helicopter was already warming up its rotors, ready to take her toward something that looked like home. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Your support means everything to us. What would you have done in Rachel's position? Drop a comment below, and let's talk about it.